Now, the United States said on Wednesday that it had attacked 14 missiles that were loaded and were to be fired from Yemen. And this was the fourth day of US strikes in less than a week on Iran-backed Houthi militants who've been attacking merchant ships in the Red Sea. Now, according to the US Central Command, a drone launched by the Houthi rebels had struck a US-owned vessel. Ship tracking sites show that the boat then turned back towards the Suez Canal. The Houthi attacks and the response from the US follow the outbreak of fighting in Gaza between Israel and Hamas, which the US and others classify as a terrorist group. With tensions rising in the Middle East, there are concerns that a wider regional conflict could develop.
Israeli bombs strike Khan Yunis in the Gaza Strip after more than 100 days of fighting. Despite claims that the war is entering a new phase, there has been little sign of a let-up in a conflict, which the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza says has cost over 23,000 Palestinian lives. On the Israeli side, almost 1,500 have been lost. What started with an unprecedented terror attack on October the 7th is quickly spilling out beyond the borders of Israel and Gaza, drawing in Israel's traditional ally, the United States, on the one side, and on the other, Hamas backer Iran. Recent days have seen dozens of attacks throughout the region. In Yemen, Iran-backed Houthi rebels are continuing their campaign to disrupt international shipping lanes. That despite dozens of airstrikes from the United States and others targeting Houthi military installations. In Iraq and Syria, Tehran attacked several sites, including one it claims was being used as an Israeli spy headquarters. Lebanon has also seen several Israeli airstrikes, which the Israel Defense Force says were targeting Hamas leaders and Hezbollah.
Welcome to Davos.
As world leaders gather in Davos for the World Economic Forum, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan warned the world was on a path to an escalation of hostilities in the Middle East. An escalation that could see the bloody conflict that began on October the 7th spreading to the wider region.
OK, let's put this into perspective with Ian Lesser. He's the Vice President of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, which is a non-partisan American public policy think tank, and his expertise includes Middle Eastern security affairs. Ian, thanks so much for your time today. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of this, can I ask you, on a scale of 1 to 10, how dangerous do you deem these current developments in the Middle East?
Well, it's good to be with you. It won't surprise you probably that I would say 8. But we weren't at 8 over the last years. We were at perhaps 5. There was always the potential for escalation. Many of the things that we're seeing now are actually building on long-standing unresolved disputes, frictions, violent actions, all sorts of things that existed beforehand. But they've come together now in a very dangerous way.
Can we focus in on Iran's strikes on Pakistan and now Islamabad's retaliation? Do you see a link here to the Israel-Hamas war?
I actually don't necessarily see a link, except to say that Iran is now in a mode of striking out at various groups around the region on its borders in ways that probably are driven by the fact that the regime simply sees this as integral to its survival, that it's simply built into the sort of operating strategy of the regime in Tehran that they should be actively striking at groups working against their interests and supporting other kinds of cross-border terrorism in many cases that they see as promoting their interests. And so it's a period of particular activism for Iran, but also there are probably groups looking to take advantage of this even inside Iran, as we saw ISIS striking in Iran not long ago.
Okay. So you're saying that Tehran provoking so many actors at once is essentially it trying to show its own strength?
Well, I think, just like many regimes, Iran sees the protection of its sovereignty, and not only that, but its own regime survival is something that is foremost in its planning. And, the ability to keep supporting these movements is something that's simply built into the structure of the regime. And of course, there are now many, many more disputes, conflicts coming to the surface where Iran is going to see some stake in intervening. And I think that's what we've seen in Iran and in Iraq and now in Pakistan.
Looking at the Israel-Hamas war, do you think that a resolution to this conflict could allow things to more or less return to where they were? Or has a wider geopolitical struggle, started now that will essentially reshape the Middle East?
Well, the crisis in Gaza obviously builds on a very long-standing unresolved dispute between the Palestinians and Israel. And that's really the underlying issue here. Many people over decades have tried to make progress on that front. Sometimes it's looked better than others. We're at a particularly low moment now. I think if there is a ceasefire in Gaza, it certainly would help, but it's not going to resolve many of the things that we see happening. It's not really going to change many of these dynamics. Hezbollah and Lebanon will still have the same grievances with Israel. Israel will still have its same security concerns. Iran will have its own interests in the region. And, the fear, of course, is that now, in a sense, we're pulling on a string and you don't really know where this ends.
And where will all of this leave Israel, do you think? I mean, will it now be in a weaker diplomatic position in the region? Might it now be forced to make certain concessions that it had ruled out in the past, Palestinian statehood, for example?
Well, much of this depends, obviously, on the political equation inside Israel, and that's in flux, obviously, in the wake of events. Israel, before the current set of crises, had been in a really rather strong position diplomatically in normalization with many countries that were important to Israel in the Arab world. That now, much of it, not all of it, has fallen apart. In some ways, it's surprising in a way that, given what is happening, that certain relationships have actually been preserved in a sense, with Saudi Arabia, most surprisingly. But obviously, there are others where there was an opening, including with Turkey, that have now, really been set back. And so, yes, I mean, Israel does face greater diplomatic isolation. It's not complete in any sense, but it's something that any Israeli government is going to have to reckon with in the coming years.
Ian Lesser, Vice President of the German Marshall Fund. Ian, thanks so much for your time today and for your insights.
Good to be with you.
And it's to Gaza now, where a shipment of medicine has arrived, intended for scores of Israeli hostages being held in the territory, as well as for Gaza's own desperate population. The delivery comes after Qatar and France mediated a deal between Israel and the militant group Hamas, which is deemed a terrorist group by many countries. It's the first agreement between Israel and Hamas since a week-long ceasefire in November. Now, the Israeli president, Isaac Herzog, has called Iran an evil empire which is at the root of tensions in the Middle East. He was speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, and he said that Hamas, which many countries classify as a terrorist group, was armed and financed by Tehran. Iran was using Hamas, he said, to derail stability not only in the region, but in the entire world.
Right, let's get some analysis now with Mayrav Zonshine. She's a senior analyst with the International Crisis Group. Mayrav, in the past few days, we've seen the Houthis and the U.S. exchange fire, Hezbollah continue attacks on the Israeli border, Iran attack targets in Iraq and Syria. I mean, is this the region-wide war many have been fearing?
I think it's fair to say that we are in a regional war. It's not an all-out war. There's degrees. And I think where I'm standing in Israel, if there was an all-out war with Lebanon, with Hezbollah, it would look quite different where I'm sitting in Tel Aviv. So there's obviously, it could get a lot worse. But as far as Israelis are concerned, they're fighting on several fronts. And I think as far as some analysts would argue, and I probably would agree, that in some ways the U.S. and Israel are now at war with Iran in various ways.
And speaking about Iran, because Iran does appear to be heavily involved, whether it's with the Houthis in Yemen or Hezbollah in Lebanon or militias in Iraq and Syria, what does Iran want?
Right. Well, I'm not an expert on Iran, but I can tell you that this is, we're seeing after October 7th, kind of the culmination of years of a buildup of power that Iran has directly funded and in different indirect ways has built up as well. And we're seeing it now in action. And so I think that is something that is both directly and indirectly a product of Iranian strategy to build up power and project it against Israel and the U.S. And we're seeing it now take effect. And that doesn't mean that Iran is necessarily directing what's happening. I think the Houthis are, somewhat autonomous and not always cooperative. Hezbollah has its own interests in Lebanon. While it's a very difficult and failing state right now, it's still a state. And in Hamas, for example, the October 7th attack, it's quite likely that Iran didn't know about it, even though it works into its strategy of keeping up pressure and attacking Israel. So I think what we're seeing is a culmination of years and years of building up of power and strategy.
Given this build-up, do you think that the future of how this moves forward depends on how the Israel-Hamas war turns out, or have things now been set in motion that are independent of the outcome of that war?
It's a very good question, and it's one that I'm also grappling with, but I think it's pretty clear, especially from the short pause that we had in late November in the Israel-Gaza war, that if there was a full ceasefire in Gaza, that we would see a cessation of hostilities on most of those fronts, if not all of those fronts. That doesn't mean that those don't have their own nature, that they could, spiral out of control. But I think what we've learned since October 7th is that the entire regional stability of the Middle East depends in large part on what's happening in Israel and Palestine. And so absolutely the first thing to do would be to immediately call for and implement a ceasefire here, and then hope that that would start to calm the situation and de-escalate across the region. And then, of course, you would have to turn to diplomacy.
How likely are we, realistically, Mayrav, to get a ceasefire at this stage?
Unfortunately, it does not look good. There's even a fight within the war cabinet in Israel and amongst the families of the hostages who would very much like to see a cessation of the war right now in order to secure the release of the hostages. That's something that they're pressuring the government on. The prime minister has said outright that he refuses. He has his own political and domestic reasons to do that as well, but he also claims that the goal of deteriorating, destroying, dismantling, whatever you want to call it, of Hamas is still something that he believes Israel will achieve, and he wants a lot of time to do that. I think the way to get to a ceasefire is for the U.S. to pressure Israel to agree to one, and it has not done that so far.
But can U.S. pressure actually work on Israel? I mean, the U.S. has been trying to pressure Israel for a number of weeks now. We've had deliberations at the UN Security Council as well. But Israel continues with its operation in Gaza. In fact, it is winding it down, but the operation does continue. How much influence does the U.S. really have on Israel?
The U.S. has a lot of leverage. It could condition its military weaponry and armament of Israel that Israel relies on. It could condition aid, things that have been floated now by certain progressive Democrats, something that has been quite taboo in the U.S., but is now becoming a little bit more accepted. And that would be the leverage. The U.S. has the power. It has chosen not to use it. I think Biden has really tried to go along with Israel's war effort and to try and navigate Israel into a more strategic place. But Israel clearly isn't going in that direction. And the U.S. also has sided with Israel in this war. So it would require a lot of political will and capital from the Biden administration when they're now entering an election year. So it would be something Biden would have to really go all out for.
We'll leave it there for the time being, but thanks so much for all that context. Mayrav Zonshine from the International Crisis Group. Thanks so much.
Thank you.